You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and today's conversation will focus on ESG. Why are environmental, social, and governance issues increasingly top of mind for company stakeholders? How has ESG impacted the board, and what lies ahead for the whole ESG range? Joining me today is Gaby Sulzberger. She's a seasoned financial executive who serves as general partner of Rustic Canyon Fontis Partners, a private equity firm in California. She's also a director on, almost every board I can think of, Gaby, including MasterCard, Acorn, Cerevel Therapeutics, True Food Kitchen, and Warby Parker. We're fortunate also to have Gaby as a trustee of the Conference Board. Gaby, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve. It is really great to be here.
So, Gaby, you have had a ton of experience on private and public company boards, and you have great expertise in governance. And now what's been the focus in the past few years of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance. Just talk a bit about what is ESG and why is it important to investors and other stakeholders?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which this isn't entirely new. One way or another, the various elements have been important to boards and companies. We used to describe it, I think, with much less description, just the precision, but, corporate responsibility. And, I think what's happened is we've gotten much clearer and much more focused over the last several years, in part, because issues attendant to climate and social issues, have escalated, but we've just gotten much more focused on the issues themselves, as well as the interdependence of these issues and our role as board members.
These issues are taken up mostly in the governance committee, but now increasingly with the whole board. In your experience on the board, is that the way you see it, that it's no longer a committee thing, but it's really owned by the whole board?
I think it's really evolving. Originally we used to think about this as kind of a lens for managing risks. And when we did, I think it did make sense that it would be in a committee. What I'm seeing now is increasingly we're seeing it as a source of opportunities and integral to corporate strategy. And as a result is really being elevated to the whole board, I think increasingly so. And one other piece, though, is we also see that elements land within different committees as well. So, if it's your HR comp committee, can be looking at DEI and employee issues. Audit committee can be looking at risk mitigants around climate, or our net zero committee. So it can live and should live within various committees, but I think increasingly we are seeing the larger strategic issues and implications rising to the level of the whole board.
Yeah, and that's the board level. It's changed a lot from a management perspective too. I remember, 15, 20 years ago, some of the, most advanced companies were hiring their first sustainability person, and then that was sort of a staff person that was parked, over in the corner. This is really now a strategic issue for the entire management team in every company.
Yeah, I agree. We are beginning to see the emergence of ESG officers. I think that's really healthy. And in some of the cases on my boards, it's at a very senior level within the strategy teams, which I think is also really appropriate because, again, for ESG to be to really endure and be impactful, it's got to be integral, to the strategy of an organization.
Part of this was driven by this move from shareholder primacy to so-called stakeholder governance. Talk a little bit about stakeholder governance and then why ESG is so important across these stakeholders.
Yeah, I think, we have come to really appreciate that in order for companies and organizations to really do their jobs, there was a day when we used to just think about kind of shareholder return, but I think we've come to appreciate that companies and organizations have a broader purpose and an order ultimately to deliver on that shareholder return. You have to meet the needs of your various stakeholders. And, as it relates to ESG, the issues are so complex. So the way employees think about these issues and investors think about these issues and, other stakeholders think about these issues can be really different. But the fact is they are all thinking about these issues. And so it is, behooves the board then to also be intendant and aware and understand, kind of what the underlying concerns are so that we can fully address them. But it does, one, the E is very different than the S is very different than the G. And then the underlying interest that these different stakeholders have is also very interesting. So it becomes complex.
Yeah. And it used to be that the interest was balkanized. You had the sort of the green folks who were focused on environmental, da-da-da-da-da. But now you have investors themselves, portfolio managers, the large investment firms, index fund firms, who are focused on ESG broadly as a part of the corporate social purpose. And that's an important distinction versus what we saw years ago, isn't it?
Very, very much so. I know the last that I've seen is something like a third of all global AUM is somehow in one way or another incorporating sustainability into its investment decisions. And by all accounts, that's only growing. So clearly it's become a very important movement within the investor community.
This has also been in the past more of a public company issue. You've been on a lot of private company boards and involved with your own investments. How has it moved over to the private company world?
Yeah, and so what I would say is there are some similarities, right? What we're really talking about is being responsive to the interests of an institutional investment community. And that's true if you're a public company or if you're a private company. And these investors have diverse investment motivations. They weigh these factors very differently. How they approach these investment and thematically is different, but they are increasingly not only concerned, but they are letting the fiduciaries who manage their money, whether it's a public company or in this case, I think we're really kind of talking about the private equity firms and venture capital firms who are managing huge pools of capital and investing in companies that may or may not reflect the ESG priorities that these investors have. So I think that's also a tide that we're beginning to see turn in a pretty meaningful way. And these PE firms and VC firms, they're smart, they're agile. I think, in the last year or two, you're really seeing them also pivot on these issues in a way that's pretty meaningful.
And the money that comes to the private equity world comes from university endowments, foundation endowments, pension funds. So the sources of the funds are really worried about what's going on in the world. And I think what we're seeing, I think broadly, and you've talked about this, is, a social awareness, and that is really permeating everything, from the government to the business world. And so, you're hearing it not only on the fringe, but, mainstream conversations today.
Well, absolutely. Again, back to the earlier point, so many of our key stakeholders really care about this. We've talked a little bit about kind of an investor community that certainly does, but our customers, millennials, Gen Z, we know they care, and we should take a minute to talk about our employees. Again, millennials, Gen Z, clearly they care, about ESG, and in this war for talent that we're all, kind of addressing, ESG is an important tool for both retention and attraction of talent.
Yeah, and I think maybe previous generations weren't as focused on it, but it wasn't that they didn't care. It was just that there was such a pressure on CEOs and boards to focus on quarterly shareholder return. And I think now that people have awakened to the broader goals of society and the, what you've called the notion of corporate purpose, I think it allows companies and boards to focus not only on producing shareholder value, but on these broader goals. And it's not just sitting on the side anymore. It's part of their operating strategy. And, in terms of what products that they're making, how they're doing this, and so it's how they're sourcing products. Talk about that whole supply chain and the strategy part of it.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think that what, really has shifted is an understanding that doing this right is part of the way we do deliver shareholder returns. Or another way of saying it is, if we really screw this up, it's much less likely that we will be able to deliver the returns. And so I think that's become part of the, investor ding, is that, they see all of this as a proxy for good governance. But us executing and being really thoughtful about how we are going to implement on the E and the S and the G, understanding which are going to be our priorities, which are the ones that, kind of strategically help build our business, both in terms of employee engagement and customer engagement. I know I'll use the example of MasterCard. We've been a leader in financial inclusion for years. It's inherent to our strategy as a company. It's part of, kind of how we think about the world, but really it's integral to our strategy. And I think ultimately, it doesn't just kind of sit on top. It is how we execute, all aspects of our business. And important, as we kind of think about not only employees and customers, but other key stakeholders like governments, as we are increasingly dealing in a nationalized, kind of world, regulators. So the notion that it doesn't just kind of sit on top of or sit to the side, but it is really integral to corporate strategy is I think ultimately the places where you see it be most successful.
Yeah, and what's especially exciting about this is you probably remember, 25 years ago, we used to have this debate over short-termism versus long-termism. Mm-hmm. And in a way, this is a sign that long-termism is winning, because, people are not as focused on short-term profits only. It's the long-term, and the long-term is about this whole globe that we sit on and the environment that we're doing and the impact on that. So it's really a long-term strategy.
I completely agree. However, that only works when we do a really fulsome and clear job of articulating our strategy, engaging with shareholders, helping them to really understand how these decisions are integral to strategy and what the expected payoff in return is going to be of those investments over time. And so I think that's an area that sometimes we have not been, as good at as, and I think there's a lot of learning going on around that. But the telling of the story, the disclosures, again, the shareholder engagement is really all the more important as we think about this, because one, as you say, it's long term, and two, some of this is relatively new and there aren't the kind of clear standards and metrics, or at least they're in the process of being developed, but they're not fully established. And so all of that makes it much more nuanced.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, your point was earlier that about a third of assets under management are, really truly focused on this. And so we're not at 100%. So that, I think that's your point. And so therefore explaining this in a way that is, that is clear strategically is important.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just again, recognizing that our investor base has, even the 30% is looking at this in a very nuanced and complex way, but not all are. And so we need to be very clear about how we tell a story and why this essentially makes sense to our longer term strategy and vision.
So far, we've talked about why a broad swath of stakeholders care about ESG, the marked shift in how investors view ESG, and next we'll talk about what lies ahead and the challenges that boards will face in juggling all this. We'll take a short break and be right back.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our conference board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the conference board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Gaby Sulzberger. So Gaby, I've got to ask you to talk about this initiative that you started with Ursula Burns called the Board Diversity Action Alliance, and you've done some really interesting work on the S of ESG. Talk about your work and how it started.
Yeah. So clearly, over the last year and a half, one of the areas with the S that we become more focused on is diversity and inclusion. And so through this work, we initially were focused on kind of the diversity or lack thereof of public company boards. The work migrated so that we also began looking at private company boards, and we undertook a review of, generally private companies are relatively opaque about, they don't have to disclose, but when they go public is the moment that, a lot more information is available. So we looked at the 18 largest PE and venture capital firms, really the leaders in the industry. And we looked at all the companies that they took public over the last 20 years. And what we saw was that out of about 4,800 different directors that they put on all of their various boards, there was only 46 that were Black. It was something like 10% women. So the boards themselves were not very diverse. We also looked at the C-suite. There was something like 3,800 executives across all of the 837 companies that went public. And of those 3,800 executives, there was only 26 African Americans, and that includes general counsel, head of HR, CFO, the whole. So over a 20-year period, to only place 26 Black executives on all of these portfolio companies was really, really a concern. And so that's why we say, like, looking at the S, looking at the governance, both in public companies, but private companies as well, private companies that affect our economy, create so many jobs, disrupt and innovate in ways that are so important. We really think, and we believe that the institutional investor community is becoming much more aware and focused on these things, but it's very, very important. And clearly there's a lot of work to do because they haven't been held accountable in the same way that and don't have the transparency that public companies do.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at it because you'd think that this is largely, or I shouldn't say largely, but it's a factor in the tech industry, both in new companies and startups and all the way to public companies, where these are supposedly the most progressive companies. At least they are in terms of how they're engaging in society, all the apps and all the various technology, and yet they are the least developed and the least progressive as it comes to their management diversity and their board diversity.
I think, like a lot of things, we say that it's usually not an intent to exclude, but it comes from a lack of intent to include. And I think these are fast moving companies, like busy executives, trying to execute really quickly. And so what happens is, like, they have kind of a, the venture firms have a pipeline of execs that they use. And so they got to put somebody in this role and they just go to that pipeline and bam, it happens within. So what really there needs to be intention to expand that network of relationships, both for boards as well as for the executive suite. And that is going to require an investment of time and intention. And I think that's really the piece that's been missing. I think that the good news is that it's not only, investors that are pressuring, but it's an employee community that is also just not tolerating this in the same kind of way that 10 or 15 years ago they might have. And so there's a lot of pressure coming both internally and externally. And these firms are smart. The people are smart. They do know how to respond to pressure and to economic reality. And so I'm encouraged. We are already seeing, progress on a lot of fronts. So I'm generally optimistic that we will see more change. But again, there is a lot of work to be done.
Well, and then so one of the biggest challenges is simply awareness. It's amazing when you talk to these people and you say, why don't you have any diverse people in your senior management team? And why isn't you? They just look at you and it's like it's never dawned on them. Some of this is just breaking through and getting them to lift their head up and, look more broadly and think about these issues. And your efforts here are really terrific because they're really productive. They're open. You're not attacking companies. You're trying to work with them and raise awareness.
Yeah, we were very, very kind of explicit from the beginning that we would not share the results of any individual venture capital firm or private equity firm. It was not about shaming. It really was just about bringing more awareness to this issue. Because again, we don't think it was any kind of nefarious intent. It was just that this was something that there has not been attention. It was not a priority. And as you say, if like nobody's in the room to raise their hand and say, hey, wait a minute, I've been in like this all day board meeting and we've had 15 different executives come in the room and we've not seen one person of color. If it just doesn't occur to anybody to raise the question, it just the day goes on and people don't, all is well. And so it really just it is a point of just building awareness.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And the conference board established an initiative a few years ago called Every Other One, when the number of women or the percentage of women on boards was down around 15%. And the point was, look, let's not attack, but let's get going on this. And, let's replace every other retiring, director with a woman. We're not asking to remake the company, but get it there. And now, we've seen some pretty good results, from this initiative as well as many others. And we're closer to 30%, not where we need to be, but it's really good progress. And I think awareness is important.
That was such an important initiative and it made a huge impact. I think that's the point. We do have Playbook. We do have evidence that when we are attending to this, like even our data, when we look over the 20 years, we're able to chunk it in 5-year increments. And over the last 5 years, women have made huge strides, both in the C-suite and on the boards of these private companies. The numbers as it relates to Black and Hispanic is flat. But we have playbooks. We know that when we kind of apply attention to it, when we expand networks, when we put the heat on our recruiters and we say we're not going to tolerate a slate that doesn't have diversity on it, there is a playbook to work from that we know has been successful. And I think we just need to use that playbook and apply it to some different groups.
Amen. Amen. The whole activist investor environment seems to be using ESG issues now, much more aggressively than they have in the past. Give some examples of what you're seeing and what should boards be doing to prepare for this more proactively?
Yeah, it is very interesting. I was in a set of meetings with lawyers and investment bankers, and apparently, these activist investors who sat on the sidelines for much of 2020 because of COVID have all this money to put to work. And so this has been apparently one of the most active year for these campaigns in the last 6 years. And they're waging the campaigns differently, kind of more below the radar screen, private engagement with boards that we're not even fully aware of, and using this lever of ESG. Very often it's the DEI part of the ESG that's being used. And it's because many boards and C-suites, as we were just saying, are underrepresented and don't have diversity, that they're able to use that as a wedge device to get proxy access. I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of ironic. I think of them as relatively short-term in perspective. So to use this kind of longer term rationale as a way to get access to proxy is is really interesting. I think that it just gives boards another reason to be focused on these issues. And it kind of all what we've been talking about over the last half hour as it relates to strategy and how important it is to our employees and our shareholders, as if that wasn't reason enough to be, kind of at the top of our game and thoughtful about ESG and our ESG strategy and telling the story effectively and clearly and engaging with shareholders about our thinking on these issues. Well, then I would think that the threat of an activist campaign would push you over the top and to make sure that, it really was a priority in the boardroom.
Yeah, it's really a good point. You mentioned DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion as the one way that they're pushing. Another way they're pushing is greenhouse gas emissions. Talk about, the environment, global warming, global greenhouse gases, and how, activists are coming in on that issue.
Well, we've seen some very high profile cases, ExxonMobil kind of most recently, and these campaigns are quite effective. Again, it just behooves as a board to be really clear what your net zero commitment is, kind of what time frame, how you're thinking about it. Are you asking the right questions? Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. There's two thoughts. One is how are we thinking about it? Are you at least asking the right questions? And then secondly, where you land on these issues, it's complicated, but at a minimum, you need to have given thought and articulated how and why you're making the investment, why you're thinking about the horizon that you are. And I think in the cases where boards have fallen short, is they just hadn't even really kind of fully begun that journey or had not clearly communicated that to the shareholder community. So it left them vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of these companies and industries, frankly, have sort of had their heads down. The energy industry used to say, look, we're focused 40 years out. We're not thinking about these kinds of issues. And boom, all of a sudden you've got the whole world changing.
That day is done. If your board has not had the conversation about what the commitment's going to be, and again, where you land may differ. Is it 2050? Is it 2040? How you're going to invest? Is it scope 1, scope 2? Like, the issues are complicated. But if you haven't really begun in a meaningful and thoughtful way, having those conversations with your senior leadership team, then you are vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think your point is you've got to be discussing this now. It's not no longer a short-term issue. You can't just look down the road. Every industry is either you could think of it as vulnerability, but they also have an opportunity here to really define themselves and define the future.
I agree. I really am. I'm a fan of Paul Pullman. Harvard Business Review recently did an article that's, I think, nicely summarizes his book, Net Positive, which is exactly that theory. We talk about it as net zero, but strategically, we need to look at it as a net positive, how we can not just address these issues, but as corporations contribute and make impact in ways, that truly are win for environment, win for the communities we serve, and then and as a result, win for our shareholders.
Yeah, Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. All right, last question. The challenge, I guess, for both boards and management teams, and collectively together as a collegial group, is to think about how to balance all this, because you can't just pick one of these constituencies. You can't just say we'll destroy shareholder value and do or you have to balance and optimize the whole thing. So how do you do that in a boardroom?
Yeah, clearly there is no one size fits all. So, and I believe that as a board member, we're not expected to have the answers. Our job is to ask the good questions. And, so I think that part of that set of questions is, what are the most material ESG issues that our company can impact? Based on the needs of the market and our own positioning, and thinking about what they are as it relates to our company's business and our strategy. And then what is our level of ambition? Do we want to be a leader? Do we want to be, or are we satisfied, in some categories with just being baselines? Clearly, you don't want to be a laggard, but what the issues are, how we want to think about them, the investment we want to make as it pertains to our ambition. There's just a lot. It's right for the kind of strategic thinking and conversation that we are accustomed to doing in many areas. And so this is just a new category that we haven't approached in the same way. But, we were talking about playbooks. We have playbooks for how we think about corporate allocation and resource allocation and strategy. And so I think what we're doing is now laying this as a topic area to think about how we balance those different interests and priorities. It's super, super important to do. If you're not having those conversations right now and, in this coming year of agendas, then that really does speak to I think, a governance issue that would be a concern.
Words of wisdom. If you're not talking about it, start. And that's the most important thing. Gaby Sulzberger, thanks for joining us today.
It was really a pleasure. Thanks, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader, business leader, to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in economics, public policy, ESG, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your children, with your grandchildren, because I know they want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.